member associations, and disciplinary groups. IUFoST promotes the advancement and application of food science and technology. These efforts address some of the most pressing global challenges, from food safety and nutrition to sustainability and innovation. As a recognized global voice for food science, IUFoST works closely with international partners and institutions. They foster scientific collaboration, capacity building, and knowledge exchange that benefit both policy and practice. Strengthening food science and technology for humanity.
The Global Food Regulatory Science Society. GFoRSS mission includes knowledge generation and dissemination, underpinning food regulatory decisions, in support of food control systems, Our interventions focus on promoting food regulatory scientific disciplines, consistent reliance on food regulatory sciences enables robust food control programs, contributing to more resilient food systems and a safe, accessible, abundant and nutritious food supply.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الإخوة والأخوات الكرام، السيدات والسادة، الزملاء الكرام، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. نرحب بكم في هذه الندوة الأولى من سلسلة الندوات المشتركة في علوم تشريعات الأغذية، والتي تنظم بالشراكة ما بين المنظمة العربية للتنمية الصناعية والتقييس والتعدين AIDSMO والاتحاد العالمي الدولي لعلوم وتكنولوجيا الأغذية وعضوه المنخرط المختص في علوم تشريعات الأغذية المنظمة العالمية لعلوم تشريعات الأغذية GFoRSS. في إطار الرؤية المشتركة ما بين كل هذه المنظمات لدعم نشر المعلومات العلمية التي تشكل أساساً لتشريعات وتنظيم الأغذية، وتعزيز الاستثمار في بناء القدرات العلمية في مجال تشريعات الأغذية في المنطقة العربية، تطلق المنظمة العربية للتنمية الصناعية والتقييس والتعدين AIDSMO بالتعاون مع المنظمة العالمية لعلوم تشريعات الأغذية العضو المنخرط في الاتحاد العالمي لعلوم وتكنولوجيا الأغذية IUFoST هذه السلسلة من الندوات العلمية التي تعرض عليكم بطريقة افتراضية، والتي ستختص بمعلومات تتعلق بعلوم تشريعات الأغذية. ستتضمن هذه السلسلة ندوات شهرية بإذن الله تتناول عدد من المواضيع المتخصصة والراهنة في مجال تشريعات الأغذية بمشاركة نخبة من أبرز العلماء والخبراء، سواء كان ذلك من المنطقة العربية أو على الصعيد الدولي. وتشمل هذه الندوات استعراضا أيضا لأحدث التطورات في علوم تشريعات الأغذية، ومعلومات حول تقييم سلامة الأغذية بما في ذلك الأغذية المستحدثة وعمليات التصنيع المبتكرة، بالإضافة إلى دعم عملي لكل من يهتم بالرقابة على الأغذية، وأيضا للشركاء في قطاع الصناعات الغذائية والمعنيين من أصحاب المصلحة في المنطقة العربية وخارجها. ونهدف إن شاء الله من خلال هذه المبادرة إلى خلق منصة معرفية تفاعلية تسهم في دعم اتخاذ القرار المستند على الأسس العلمية وتعزيز مسار لتحديث الأنظمة الغذائية في المنطقة العربية وإلى المنطقة أيضا إلى جميع أنحاء العالم.
في عصر مليء بالتحديات وكذلك الفرص، يبرز التعاون والتكامل كأحد الركائز الأساسية للتنمية المستدامة، كما يعتبر قطاع الصناعة من القطاعات الواعدة والمليء بالفرص في العالم وفي المنطقة العربية خاصة، لا سيما قطاع الصناعات الغذائية. انطلاقاً من رؤية وأهداف المنظمة العربية للتنمية الصناعية والتقييس والتعدين، تم إطلاق برنامج تعاون بين المنظمة والجمعية العالمية لعلوم تشريعات الأغذية من خلال مذكرة تفاهم تم توقيعها مطلع العام 2022. ولتحقيق أهداف هذه المذكرة تسعى الجهتان إلى تنفيذ أنشطة عدة ضمن إطار عمل مشترك من أجل تعزيز المشاركة الفعالة للدول العربية الأعضاء في المنظمة في فعاليات هيئة الدستور الغذائي، العمل على موائمة المواصفات الغذائية العربية من خلال برنامج المواصفات العربية، تطوير القدرات في مجال أنظمة وتشريعات الأغذية، ونشر أفضل الممارسات ذات الصلة. وفي إطار هذا التعاون تم تنظيم وتنفيذ العديد من الأنشطة في الدول العربية، نذكر منها عقد 25 اجتماع تنسيقي عبر تقنية الاتصال عن بعد لنقاط اتصال الدول العربية في هيئة الدستور الغذائي، تحضيراً للجان الفنية ودورات الدستور الغذائي والتي تتمثل في 17 لجنة، التحضير لعدد من دورات الدستور الغذائي، منها عقد 3 دورات تدريبية حضورية في إطار بناء قدرات الدول العربية الأعضاء حول أفضل الممارسات في وضع مواصفات الدستور الغذائي في كل من المغرب، تونس، الأردن. تنظيم ندوات عربية سنوية للدستور الغذائي للمنطقة العربية لمناقشة آخر المستجدات في مجال المواصفات الغذائية وبمشاركة أبرز صانعي القرار في الدستور الغذائي. تم إنشاء مجموعات عمل عربية إلكترونية في مجالات تكتسي أهمية بالمنطقة العربية، اهتمت بعدة مواضيع، منها تجميع وتحليل البيانات الخاصة بنسبة الرطوبة في التمور الطازجة بالمنطقة، وهي أحد السلع الاستراتيجية للمنطقة العربية إنتاجاً وتصديراً. مجموعة العمل العربية الإلكترونية المعنية بالفول السوداني، مجموعة العمل العربية الإلكترونية المعنية بإعداد مواصفة حليب النوق، برامج تدريبية لتنمية القدرات في مجال التحاليل المخبرية التنظيمية للأغذية، المساهمة في تنظيم العديد من المؤتمرات الدولية حول سلامة وجودة الغذاء المنعقدة في العديد من الدول العربية، إعداد وتقديم 5 وثائق قاعة الاجتماعات CRDs إلى الجلسات العامة للجان الدستور الغذائي وتقديمها من قبل المنظمة كعضو مراقب في هيئة الدستور الغذائي، إطلاق المنصة التفاعلية للمبادرة العربية للدستور الغذائي لتعزيز الحوكمة في تنسيق المواقف العربية ذات الصلة. إنشاء القسم العربي لمنظمة الرابطة الدولية للتعاون التحليلي الرسمي AOAC المعنية بوضع طرق التحاليل المخبرية المعتمدة. إضافة إلى تنفيذ العديد من ورش العمل الافتراضية المتخصصة وبرامج تدريب إلكترونية وغيرها من الأنشطة ضمن إطار تطبيق أهداف مذكرة التعاون. تواصل المنظمة العربية للتنمية الصناعية والتقييس والتعدين، ومن خلال التعاون مع الجمعية العالمية لعلوم تشريعات الأغذية، مسيرتها في الإسهام في تنمية وتطوير الصناعة والاقتصاد والبنية التحتية المستدامة للجودة في الوطن العربي.
Now, the first webinar of this AIDSMO GFoRSS Webinar Series will be dedicated to risk-based decision-making for food regulations. And I'm pleased to welcome and introduce my colleague, Dr. Greg Paoli from Risk Science International. Greg is, in fact, a fellow member of the board of directors of the Global Food Regulatory Science Society and a renowned expert in the area of food risk analysis and risk analysis in general, so all aspects related to risk and assessment management and the application of the risk analysis framework. We wanted to start with this particular theme because, as we know, risk analysis is the foundation of the decision-making process when it comes to food regulatory measures pertaining to food safety and nutrition. And I hope that this, in fact, will offer the general background of various other interventions and webinars that we will be organizing as part of this series. Now, as a member of the leadership of both organizations, the International Union of Food Science and Technology and the Global Food Regulatory Science Society, its regulatory group, I wish to emphasize our strong commitment to supporting science-based regulatory capacity across the regions. And this partnership that we enjoy with the Arab Industrial Development Standardization and Mining Organization to support the modernization of food regulatory processes within the Arab region is a great opportunity for us to contribute to this effort of science dissemination related to regulatory processes. So we will hear today this introduction that is given by Greg. Greg, thank you for joining and thank you for contributing with your expertise. And without further ado, I will give you the floor.
Thank you. I will proceed to share my screen and we'll get started. All right, well, thank you for the invitation, Sam, and the partnering organizations. I'd like to speak to you today about what I'm going to call a journey to fully risk-based decision-making in food regulatory organizations. The reason I stress that it is a journey is because even organizations who have been working on risk-based decision-making for 20 years or more are still struggling to improve and constantly advance their operations, their understandings of risk, and their conversion of those understandings into risk controls and even communication practices. So with that, I will move along. So I want to just start with some basic terminology, and you'll see the term risk-based very frequently. Less frequently, you'll see the term risk-informed. So risk-based is not really all that well defined, as I'll get into a little bit later, but it does refer to activities or decisions where an estimate of the level of risk or the level of risk reduction or even the cost effectiveness of a risk reduction is explicitly considered in conducting an activity or in making a decision. On the other hand, risk-informed is very similar to risk-based, but it's often used as a term to acknowledge that other factors other than risk purely are considered in the decision-making process. Some people prefer risk-informed because they think it's a more honest characterization of the decision-making process. So just to get an understanding of what we're ultimately speaking about, we're talking about creating a series of risk scenarios and using the outputs of those risk scenarios as the basis for decision-making. And the outputs of the risk scenario could include, as I mentioned, a level of risk reduction, or even the risk reduction and the associated cost. So all of those features can be incorporated. As you see here, we need to characterize the properties of the food, the properties of the hazard, the properties of the population, and at the intersection of those are the things like consumption models, process models, dose response models, which convert a dose to an individual into a probability of an illness, and that generates a number of cases in the population. And then we can also discuss the population burden by taking into account how severe the disease that comes from the hazard is. One thing I want to contemplate, and I'm sitting here with Sam in Egypt, and I want to just consider the idea of whether foodborne illness is frequent, or is it actually rare, or is it possibly both? And how could that be? So if we just use the example of Egypt, so we have a population here of approximately 120 million people. And if we just use simple numbers like 3 servings per day, 365 days per year, and 8 decades of life as just a general estimate, if you multiply all those things together, how many servings of food are we contemplating? In just the lifetimes of the people in Egypt today, that's 10.5 trillion meals. So that's what we're ultimately dealing with in terms of managing food safety, is managing the food safety of 10.5 trillion meals for just the people of Egypt alone. If you take that number to other countries, the number gets staggeringly large, if that's not large enough already. So on a per serving basis, foodborne illness is actually rare. On a population level, however, given that we're having 10.5 trillion meals, foodborne illness is very frequent. So just as a simple mathematical equation, if each serving has a 1 in a million probability of illness, which is a number that many people would consider quite low, even at that low level, that would be 10,500,000 illnesses in those same current Egyptian lifetimes. If each serving has a 1 in a billion probability of a fatality, that would alone be 10,500 deaths in current Egyptian lifetimes. So this is something that I think is very important to keep in mind, is that we can have a very low probability event, but when you multiply that by 10.5 trillion meals, that becomes a lot of burden of disease. So we want to reduce this. We have to also understand, and this is part of the essence of risk-based decision-making, is managing extremely low probabilities. Despite the fact that they're low, they're still very important because we have to eat every day. So let's talk about this term risk-based. As I said, risk-based or risk-informed. You can choose whichever you like. One of the key aspects of risk assessment, which is not really stressed that much, we've come to take risk assessment somewhat for granted, in the sense that everybody understands that this is the sort of current rule book for food safety. But we have to understand we've always had evidence. We've always had food safety specialists. We've always been making decisions about how to make food safer. But now we say and we impose on ourselves the obligation to use risk assessment. The key issue here is that you're processing evidence in a particular way. We're trying to determine the probability of this adverse outcome of interest, that being an illness, that being a fatality, or somewhere in between. The primary value-added feature is in the inference of the probability of adverse outcomes by appropriately combining a formal representation of the risk-generating system with the rules of calculating probability. So that's essentially what the risk assessment paradigm brings to the table. And we use the term risk-based now very, very widely. And it's widely used to describe regulatory systems, not just in food safety, but almost in every discipline of regulation, yet it's not formally defined. The term has become a badge of legitimacy for regulators. And I say that not to be sarcastic in the sense of putting quotes, badge of legitimacy. That's literally the phrase that's used in the social sciences literature in describing the behavior of regulators worldwide. Here's just an example of a screenshot of a web page, in this case, the US Federal Register, in which you can see the term risk-based being used 278 times on a single web page. You'll also notice that it is not actually defined. So despite the apparent importance of the word, there's no formal definition of what that is. And again, I want to say that that is both good news and bad news. The good news is that you can essentially decide what it's going to mean for your organization. When will we use the term risk-based? When will we not? We can have also rules-based decision-making, and that is also appropriate in some circumstances as well. So we need a balance between these things. So what is risk-based despite not being defined? What is it typically associated with? It's typically associated with the principle of proportionality in the application of risk control measures. In other words, we tackle small problems with small risk controls. We tackle large problems with significant risk controls. If we have a very, very small problem, we typically try to make it a little bit smaller. We don't necessarily want and expect to achieve zero risk. So the term risk-based is often simply an acknowledgement that zero risk is not the expected or realistic goal of an exercise. Low risk is certainly expected. Zero risk is not the expected goal. We also use risk-based to imply that the probability of harm is inherently part of the conversation, not the mere possibility of harm. We don't stop at possibility. We go on to consider probability of harm. And that will be, the probability will be duly considered in the decision-making process and the selection of risk controls to reduce it if necessary. So the other aspect is ultimately that the decision-making is based on some combination of level of risk reduction, or the ideally cost-effective risk reduction. So the term risk-based can also be used to describe two very different exercises. One is a reduction in the number and the severity of adverse outcomes. So we would clearly call that less risk. Another element of activities are directed towards gaining an understanding of the level of risk. So we want to improve the level of certainty in the level of risk. So what we achieve in that case is less uncertainty in the level of risk. And these are two very different goals with different tools and measurement schemes. So organizations that are regulatory in nature have two obligations. One is to control the level of risk, and one is to simply know the level of risk. And those both need to be applied. So you can imagine, in one sense, you're in the top right of this graphic, and you're making various activities. In one case, you may simply do an observation. You can think of observation very broadly as something like taking a sample, or something like doing a physical inspection or document inspection, any variety of things which would cause you to move to the left of this graphic, and therefore you're reducing uncertainty in the level of risk. You're not changing the level of risk, you're just reducing your uncertainty in the level of risk, which is part of your obligation. In the other direction, moving vertically, you actually mitigate the risk. You make a change. You instruct the organization to do something differently, and they make a certain change, and you've reduced the level of risk. You may also do both, in which case you're moving diagonally to the bottom left, and you've now reduced risk, and you've reduced your uncertainty in the level of risk, having also observed it. So these are important distinctions to make as to what is the benefit that's accruing from the activity that you're engaging in. We can also think about this almost in reverse. So after you've, for example, visited an establishment, you've made the observations, you've made the changes in the level of risk, and now you have the passage of time. So you have not been there in 6 months or a year or 2 years. Now you have the passing of time, and you must therefore be less uncertain. Sorry, you must be more uncertain in the level of risk. You also may presume that the organization, based on your experience with other organizations, will have lost a certain amount of control over their risk levels, and that makes it desirable to return to do an observation and possibly to control risk again. So we need to understand both why we're doing things and why we're doing things again. One thing to observe, and this is a key point for organizations, is that risk-based really operates at 4 different levels. They're different levels, but they should ideally be integrated. So let me just walk through them one at a time. Level 1 is a very high-level strategic question for an organization, which is, why does the organization do what we do exactly? Why do we do what we do? Just as important is to understand why we don't do what we don't do. Why do we not do those things? This is very important because you have to explain what you do and you have to explain what you don't do. We also usually need to understand who does what. What does government do? What does industry do? What do industry associations do? What do global institutions do? And what will risk-based ultimately mean? Given that it's not defined, as I mentioned, what does it mean for us in this place? The next level down is to simply focus on the mandate of the organization and the types of domestic hazards and foods we should be concentrating on. What also types of imported foods should we be sampling, etc. What is the prioritized list for us to deal with? Level 3 takes the output of level 2 and becomes much more operational and says, why should we inspect company X versus company Y? How frequently should we inspect company X? Those sorts of questions should also be linked to the level 2 decisions as to why we're focusing on this hazard in food, and focused on the level 1 questions, which is, what is the role of an inspection in the overall scheme of risk controls? Level 4 then is getting not just operational, but tactical in the moment decision making. So if an inspector is inspecting a milk plant, a dairy plant, and they determine that the thermometer that's used in the pasteurization process, or this system of thermometers, is simply not been calibrated and in fact is mismeasuring the temperature. What should that inspector do exactly? Are they simply to write a report, or do they order a recall on millions of liters of milk? These are also related. So level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4 ideally are an integrated system based on the same evidence-based, based on the same understanding of risk, all the way from the high-level strategy down to the inspector finding an adverse conditions in a plant. So just a few thoughts on what it really takes to construct a system of risk-informed decision-making. And I place those basically into three main categories. The first category is sort of the foundations. It's essentially matters of policy that relates to public risk and its management, and it's ultimately something that is determined in advance. It's not adjusted day to day. It's not subject to inter-individual variation in the organization. It's something that is the established basis of the organization's decision-making process. And then layered on top of that are risk management processes and risk assessment processes. And I might also add another dimension of this, which is ultimately information technology, and we may talk about that later. The question really is, how does all this work at the scale of an enterprise that is dealing with 10.5 trillion servings of food? So these are some of those foundational elements that I mentioned. The risk management principles refers to ultimately how we make decisions in the presence of uncertainty, how we make difficult trade-offs in decision-making. We also need just a few simple things, which sound very simple, but often organizations don't have these things. An inventory of all the public harms within their mandate, all of the different things which can go wrong that are the responsibility of the organization. Another key question is measurement scales. We need to be able to measure risk, and measuring risk is not easy. It's in fact very challenging, and this is something that needs to be done very carefully, and I'll give you some examples shortly about why that's so important. We also need common principles of risk assessment. So if we say we're doing a risk assessment, what does that mean exactly? Does that mean we're going to think about risk, or does that mean something more formal? And that's essentially a key component of this risk management process. We'll also need a risk control inventory. I'll give you an example of that a little bit later. And ultimately, we want to get to the point of integrating questions of cost, questions of effectiveness of risk controls. That's essentially the top of the mountain that we're climbing. To reach the summit of the mountain, you're considering costs, you're considering the risks, and you're considering whether you have an effective risk control in place, and that is worth the cost of the control. So these are just some examples of risk management principles. Risk management is driven by the pursuit of many virtues. So there's many things which we call good things, and the challenge is we can't do every good thing all at the same time. So one idea is to use the God of risk, and that's where you go where the risk is. So the highest risk gets all the attention, the lowest risk gets no middle attention, and so on. Another possible alternative is the God of risk reduction. So this is where you go where the risk can be reduced. So if you don't go to the highest risk, you go to the place where you can reduce the risk the most. So that's another thing which sounds like a good thing. There's also the God of cost-effective risk reduction. In this case, you're maximizing the overall risk reduction within a constrained budget. So this is not looking at risk one risk at a time. It's looking at your entire portfolio of risk and deciding how can we get the most risk reduction with the available budget. There's a variety of other gods which are all considered good, seeking thresholds and bringing the risk below a threshold, being consistent, acquiring knowledge. All of these things are good things to do, and risk management organizations strive for these things, but the ultimate question is, which is the highest God to be sought? So I'm going to speak a little bit about issues in risk measurement. And one thing I can't go into in any detail here, but just to recognize that there is an incredible diversity of things which are called risk assessments. And those range in complexity and type and nature in such a variable way as to almost, the word risk assessment almost has no definition. So at one extreme, you have a narrative risk assessment in which someone has written various paragraphs, 1 page, 50 pages, 100 pages, and they've ultimately characterized the risk in some way as a conclusion in that exercise. You can also do that same exercise with risky terminology. In other words, you have the appropriate language, you have the language of codex, for example, and you do your narrative work while otherwise in an otherwise structured language. The next step in this continuum is something called structured qualitative risk assessment, in which case you're forced to ask and answer certain types of questions, which leads you to a conclusion. In other words, the narrative has a defined structure, and you're posing and solving certain questions in that process. The next level of risk assessment is what we might call semi-quantitative. These are questions where there is a system at play. It's possibly we have a scoring system, or we have prescribed labels and combinatorial rules that once you've chosen and label X and label Y, it leads you to conclusion Z. So those are examples of semi-quantitative systems. And then we have at the far end of the continuum, the quantitative risk assessment process, which consists of many, many variations, but the two main categories are deterministic versus probabilistic risk assessments. And organizations need to decide and define which among these tools that's available are going to be applied in which conditions. So many of these exercises can be very valuable. The question is, will those things be appropriate for the decision making that's at hand? So I'm just going to ask you a question, and I'm not expecting an answer given that we're in a webinar context. But we have, for example, a simple situation. A physical hazard, such as you're bottling some product and broken glass is known to occur by accident at a rate of 1 in every million food packages. An imperfect test exists for the hazard. A test will be positive and detect the hazard 99% of the time. When the hazard is absent, the test will be negative 99% of the time. So that sounds like a pretty good test. The test is conducted at random on 1 food package. The test gives a positive result. So the question is, what is the probability that the food package has the defect in question? So I'll just allow you a few seconds to ponder that before I go on to the next slide. So let's think that through. There's only 3 data points here. 1 in a million, 99% positive if it's there, 99% negative if it's absent. So what would your best guess be? And here I've given you 4 options. What is the probability that the tested food package has the hazard? Maybe it's 1%. Maybe it's 99% because that's the performance of the test. Maybe it's 1 in 10,000. Maybe it's really just 1 in a million because that's the original data point. So if you didn't choose C in this option, if you chose A, B, or D, you were either off by a factor of 100 in one direction, 100 in the other direction, or even a factor of 10,000 if you thought it was 99%. The point of this mental exercise is just to understand how difficult probability is to do in your head. And this is not something that we should be doing in our head. It doesn't matter how mathematically gifted you may be. In fact, the more mathematically gifted you are, the less you should be doing this in your head because you'll be even more confident in your error. So this is something that I just want to represent in this way. We see the continuum that I mentioned across the the x-axis here, if you like, from narrative to probabilistic on the right side. And as we simplify, so we can't do a probabilistic risk assessment for every problem that we face. So we're going to make simplifications. So how simplistic can we make it before we fall off this cliff? So here you can see the image of a person on the screen with a, they're standing very close, dangerously close, you might say, to the edge of a cliff, and it's also a very foggy day. So they're not entirely sure where the edge of the cliff is. And this is one of the realities of risk-based decision-making, is that striving for simplicity and practicality is obviously desirable for the sake of getting decisions made, getting work done, but you can be dangerously close to a cliff of the nature of the example that I just gave with the piece of broken glass. And you can be incredibly wrong very quickly if we're not using the right tools and techniques to make your decisions, and relying on things like gut instincts and other matters. So I'm going to talk a little, just very quickly, about, again, some simplistic tools like risk matrices, which you very often will see with often stoplight type colors, green, yellow, red, etc., which describe the level of risk on two dimensions, one related to probability or likelihood, and the other related to impact or consequence. And here you see another variation on that same type of risk matrix. This actual risk matrix, I think if you were to type this into Google and ask for a semi-quantitative or just simply a risk matrix, you might find this very figure coming up very quickly in your search results. This is one of the most common tools out there. This tool is in fact completely wrong in its quantitative techniques. I'm not going into the details here, but just to understand that even though something looks nice, it has appropriate colors, it's not an appropriate tool to use, and it will lead you into very poor decision making if not used correctly. The other thing to understand is that risk is not really a single box in the matrix, but it's actually a line. In other words, the possibilities usually range from negligible to catastrophic, and the likelihoods can range from rare to almost certain, and those conditions can be occurring essentially at the same time. Measurement scales for public consequences. So we really need appropriate measurement scales. So what are the appropriate means to measure these public consequences? And what are inappropriate means to measure public consequences? How will we measure diverse consequences on a common scale? So I'll just give an example of that. You'll often hear this phrase. This is the phrase in English. I imagine this phrase exists in almost every language, with different examples of what you can't compare. We often say you can't compare apples and oranges. So this is actually completely, despite how common the phrase is, it's completely untrue. Comparing apples and oranges is something that you can do every day. It's both common and easy. But we do need to be very carefully thought out and mathematically defensible. Just as an example, something which is now very commonly in use in food safety is the concept of disability adjusted life years. So this concept is based on using two dimensions to consider how severe, how burdensome some outcome is. One is how severe it is. In other words, what is the degree to which one is disabled? And the other dimension is the duration of the health outcome, which is how long does it last? And so we want both of these considerations to be appropriately measured. We don't want to consider only severity. We don't want to consider only duration. We really must consider both. So for example, we have a broken leg. Not a food safety concern, hopefully, but that's an example of a health outcome which is understandable to everyone. it is considered relatively severe on a day-to-day basis. It's not pleasant. And in fact, there are things that you can't do when you have a broken leg. So we call that disability. The other dimension of a broken leg is that they almost always heal and heal very well, such that you return to full ability relatively quickly, typically in less than a year. So that's the duration component. Then we take something very different like hearing loss. Let's say, for example, we experience hearing loss at somewhere around midlife. And we assume that that's an irreversible condition, so that hearing loss will exist for the entire rest of one's life. We assume that it's not complete deafness, so that it's not completely disabling. You can still communicate with people, you can still take care of your children, all those important parts of living. However, it's not going to go away, and therefore this has a long duration. So we take that into account, and you can think of a disability adjusted life year measurement as the area of this rectangle. We can also then think about something which we don't want to think about very often, which is, for example, a childhood fatality. A fatality has the maximum severity weight, and if it's an infant, they have essentially lost 80 years of life expectancy, if that's the life expectancy where you live. So that is ultimately considered an 80 disability adjusted life years lost. So now we have a measurement scheme to take into account severity. And this is now fundamentally at work, for example, in the WHO Global Burden of Disease measurement schemes. It is increasingly used in food safety, particularly in the microbial hazards community, and less so in some of the other fields. But this is an important thing to consider, which is the severity of disease. We can also consider the frequency of that outcome, so that we have, for example, the depth dimension of this figure is the frequency component. So we have very many broken legs. This happens every day. We have a much lower frequency of hearing loss. And ideally, we have a very small level of childhood fatality. And now you consider not the area of these, but the volume of these things. And you can also imagine that these could be at the population level considered relatively equal because of their overall combination of severity, duration, and frequency. So these are as an example of a measurement scheme for risk assessment, and adopting a scheme like this or similar is a critical component to make sure that you don't ignore severity. I'm now going to switch into a conversation about risk controls and cost-effective resource allocation. So one of the things which is an important building block of a risk-based organization applying risk-based decision-making is to have a very carefully curated inventory of risk controls. And this requires us to use somewhat an expanded definition of risk controls. If you're thinking very operationally about a food system, you may think of risk controls as a cooking step or a washing step or something like that, something very physical and mechanical. But the concept of risk control at the level of a risk-based organization is much, much broader than that. It can be the most proactive thing you do, just simply providing information to someone. It can be the most reactive thing you do, which could be after the dust has settled and there's a big problem, you then go in and do an investigation of exactly how that thing happened, not because you can stop the thing from happening, but you can stop it from happening again. So those are an incredible diversity of risk controls at stake. Here I have just an image of a public risk control taxonomy that is has been prepared, and it has an incredible diversity of activities in it. There are 7 categories represented by each of these columns, and 34 possible risk controls that exist. On the left are the very most proactive, where you're essentially doing things like developing guidance for industry. In the middle, you see preventative risk communication. So this is where you're communicating to industry or the public about what they can do to reduce risk. You also have things like permissions, and then you have a significant column of activity called compliance verification. So that's all of the things which you do, which are just simply checking that things are going as you expect. And at the farthest to the right, you have your reactive controls, where you're dealing with problems as they arise and doing your best to fix them. So as you can see, this expands the concept of risk control to a much larger space than what we think of perhaps as a food technologist or an operational employee. So what we need to do is have a detailed understanding of these risk controls. We need to understand what is an acceptable level of compliance, what will we inspect, what will we understand to be something we can't really inspect because it's invisible, what are things that can be changed, what are we trying to achieve, be it risk reduction or uncertainty reduction? What is the actual goal, or is it possibly both? And then we need to understand, having done an inspection, what is it that makes us, having done an inspection today, need to go back and do that inspection again tomorrow? Not tomorrow, maybe 6 months, or maybe a year, or maybe 5 years. Maybe we don't need to inspect that facility again for 5 years. How do we justify that duration? Those are important aspects of risk control. So I'm going to speak next about the concept of resource allocation. So this is one of the most fundamental properties of an organization managing a portfolio of risks, is taking the organization's available resources and allocating them in the way to ideally maximize risk reduction for the public. We ultimately want to do this because of the sheer diversity of risks in play. And we could do another mathematical exercise, but think about the number of food businesses, the number of hazards, and the number of types of foods. Multiply those three numbers together, and you have a staggeringly large number of things in your portfolio. So how does an organization make any sense of that mandate? That ultimately requires risk-informed decision support tools and the appropriate information technology resources to support that mandate. One of the key questions in that resource allocation exercise is the concept of marginal cost effectiveness. So if you think about this graphic here, you have to the left of the screen, you have a little bit of money being spent, and maybe you can make a quick risk reduction by simply doing an inspection of an organization that you have never inspected before. And you have a great impact with that first inspection. What if you did that again and you spend a little bit more money? You spend a little bit more money. At some point, you're going to not be getting any more benefit as you spend more money. And that's the concept of marginal cost effectiveness, or incremental benefits assessment. Further allocations at some point do not give further benefit, and that money is best spent somewhere else. So let's take a look at what that looks like. This is an example. I'll just give you an example of a healthcare system. This is a classic decision-making concept in healthcare. I like to suggest to people in this food safety business that there's simply an extension of the healthcare system. They're just far upstream, hoping that the people who are their consumers never enter the emergency room. So you're part of the healthcare system, but you're upstream. And by extension, we should have the same type of thinking all the way through the system. So if we think about the concept of breast cancer, one of the most common cancers on earth, a tumor is non-compliant tissue. So tumor is a tissue that refuses to adhere to regulatory expectations of cell death. So these cells simply don't want to die, and they're therefore non-compliant. Screening of women over the age of 50, such that we have, for example, a mammogram test, that is risk-based inspection. So why would we call that risk-based inspection? It's risk-based inspection because we don't choose 40 and we don't choose 70. We've made a deliberate choice to choose to screen women over the age of 50. And we've done that because that's the most cost-effective age. If we did it at age 40, it would be too expensive. That's far too many people being tested. If we did it at age 50, that's sort of the sweet spot in which we're going to detect an appropriate number of cancers and therefore have them treated and so on. And that's therefore good. If we waited till 75, it would be too late. So, and that would not be a good risk-based decision. So that same concept applies. This is just an example of different shapes of curves that not every curve has that one shape. But in the food safety realm, we have variations on cost effectiveness. So we have compliance verification frequency. So as you inspect more and more, eventually you stop gaining risk reductions. If you do physical inspections of a commodity, perhaps a shipment arriving in your country, you could have a level of risk reduction which goes in a more linear shape. You also have various things which are kind of all or nothing. If you do that thing on the bottom left, if you do that thing, you basically bring the risk to zero, but you have to do it or not do it. You can't do it halfway. So there's a variety of different types of controls, effectiveness, and this is essentially what we need to understand to be the case when we're applying risk controls, is how much is doing less impacting us, how much is doing more affecting us. And I'll just give you an example. This is the last exhibit here, is the idea of risk-informed resource allocation through incremental cost-effectiveness analysis. So here we have three possible levels of control. We only have three controls available to us, despite the fact that I mentioned 34 controls earlier. We have three controls available. And the first thing we do is we spend a little bit of money, but we spend money in the top left of the graphic here because that's a very cost-effective for the amount of money that we've spent. We spend a little bit of money here on the right as well, but not as much. And we've only spent 25–30% of our budget by this point. We haven't yet spent on the left because it's not competitive yet in this incremental analysis. The next thing we do is we spend even more money in this top left control. We spend a bit more money here, and again, this is not effective yet. Then we spend a little bit more money here. We spend a little bit more money on the right. We spend a little bit more. We spend all of the money on the left because that has now become competitive in the battle for resources because of the marginal cost ineffectiveness of the top left. So now we've essentially spent, at this point, we've spent all of our money and we've brought the risk down to the lowest possible risk that you can achieve with the budget that you have. So that is essentially the concept of incremental cost effectiveness driving risk-based resource allocation decisions. This is essentially a very challenging thing to achieve. As I described the example of climbing a mountain later, this is essentially the very top of the mountain. However, I'd like to encourage everyone to have this type of thinking in mind, even if we don't do it quite so mathematically. We want to use these concepts to make the maximum amount of risk reduction available to us with our available budgets. So with that, I'm essentially going to close by just simply saying a few final thoughts. That a formal definition of risk-based or risk-informed doesn't really exist. That could be good since it allows you to construct that meaning for yourself, for your own organization, what it's going to mean. I have indicated my strong preference for the idea of cost-effective risk reduction being the highest goal available when managing a portfolio of risks as opposed to one risk at a time. And I also want to stress the idea that risk-informed decision-making happens at the strategic level all the way down to the tactical level. And ideally, there would be consistency in the use of evidence all the way through that system. The reason why we choose to inspect, the reason why we choose to inspect milk, the reason why we choose to send an inspector to a particular company, then the reason why you would order a recall, all are based on the same concepts of risk, hazard, harm, etc. And just again, to use the mountain analogy, everybody in across the world. I work with organizations all around the world, and everyone is essentially still climbing this same mountain. Nobody has reached the summit. Everybody's still working very hard to improve their risk management processes. With that, I'll stop there, Sam.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Greg, for this great overview. And again, I believe this is another demonstration that the fact that applying these risk-based processes, have wider applications than food safety, but in the context of food safety and in the context of food regulatory management, and with the increasing number of challenges that we will have to address, sustainability, food security, climate change, trade and economic development, and emerging technologies, we will have to apply this risk-based approach or risk-informed approach to support the decision-making process. And hopefully, while we may not reach the top of the mountain, we'll be able to climb a few more steps in that process, and hopefully will contribute also with the Arab region to this effort. We have a few minutes for some questions, and I don't know if we have, I think, some questions and answers in the chat box. If actually colleagues would like to ask questions, please identify yourselves as part of the participants, and our colleagues managing the webinar will let you in or will offer you the opportunity to interact. I'm not seeing anything in the chat, but just in case colleagues have any questions. There doesn't seem to be any immediate questions at this point. So just a reminder again that this webinar has been streamed live, and in fact will be made available on the YouTube channels of the Global Food Regulatory Science Society. Also to mention that in the next sessions of the webinar series, I guess we will be seeing some applications of the risk analysis process to a number of specific, whether be it food applications, processes, ingredients, and particularly we will have an emphasis on innovation and how we can support innovative food ingredients and food processes, but at the same time ensuring that the health of consumers continue to be protected in the Arab region and beyond. If there are no more questions, well, again, thank you so much, Greg, for sharing your expertise and your experience with us in the region and beyond. And again, also thank you to all those who participated to this webinar, and looking forward to meeting you in the next session of the AIDSMO GFoRSS Webinar Series. Thank you.
Bringing science to all health and safety will always go. Risks and benefits we contemplate, global standards we integrate. GFoRSS together we thrive, health and safety will always strive. From farm to food, let's make it right. GFoRSS for safe food we fight. Research, knowledge we share with pride, for a world where health is on our side. Collaboration and science as pillars, GFoRSS we aim for rigor.